Mr. President, I would say to the senator from Missouri that while this senator is most appreciative that he and Senator Murray have come forth in a bipartisan fashion with about half of the funding that this senator, also in a bipartisan proposal, since my colleague from Florida, Senator Rubio, is the sponsor of this amendment with this senator. I would point out to the senator's own words and him commending the administration that they recognize that this was a crisis enough to go in and borrow from the Ebola Fund $589 million to get started, since we couldn't get the Congress off dead center until now. And I do commend Senator Blunt and Senator Murray for their action. I commend the leadership for being willing to put this on the THUD bill, appropriations bill. But to suggest for the senator that he raised that point, that it was such an emergency, $589 million, but the Appropriations Committee proposal only replaces that Ebola fund of $589 million that has been taken from it, replenishes it only with $88 million instead of $589 million. By the way, the news just broke another outbreak of Ebola. Now, this senator's not here to talk about Ebola. This senator is to talk about another healthcare medical emergency, of which there is well over 100 cases in this senator's state of Florida, and Senator Rubio and I are desperately trying to help. I want to say to Senator Blunt before he leaves one other thing. He mentioned that we need to control the vector. What does that mean? The vector is the gremlin that spreads the virus, and that is the Egypti strain of mosquito. That mosquito is all over now the southern United States. It is especially in Puerto Rico. And that costs money, mosquito control. So, Mr. President, I'd like to enter into the record a letter, as an example, from one of my counties, the Osceola County Commission, saying that they desperately need the funds, that they're out of funds for mosquito control.
Without objection.
All right, so Mr. President, what Senator Rubio and I have is an emergency appropriation, although it's not treated that way in this appropriations bill, of $1.9 billion. The Centers for Disease Control predicts that up to 25% of our fellow American citizens on the island of Puerto Rico are going to be infected by the end of the year. That's 800,000 people just there. We know in the United States we have already over a reported 1,000 cases in 45 states. 113 of those 1,000 are in Florida, most of them in South Florida, Miami-Dade County, and we just had another case yesterday that brought that. Those 113 cases are spread all over the state of Florida. Now, the community leaders, as indicated by this letter from Osceola County, are saying they're out of funds. Help. This is an emergency. with 4 reported cases of the virus so far, just in that county, which is near Orlando, they have determined that they will need to triple their annual budget for mosquito control. And so the county manager writes, quote, "This public health emergency placed Osceola County under significant financial pressure. The county resources are exhausted and the funds are not readily available to respond to the disaster." And he ends up saying, lives are at stake. So think about what the House has done. A $600 million Zika bill. That's nowhere near what we need. Such a figure is not only absurd, it's an insult to the men and women who are on the front lines that are trying to battle this virus. Local governments like the one I mentioned in Osceola County. And so we've got an opportunity to respond. Now, this senator understands that it's already baked into the cake, even though this proposal by Senator Rubio and me is bipartisan. It's already baked into the cake that it's going to be the 1.1. But beware. The crisis is looming. We haven't gotten an effective method for controlling the mosquito. We do not have a vaccine. All of these things take time and they take money. And it's going to need research. The $277 million in this proposal that Senator Rubio and I think need to go to the National Institute of Health to accelerate their research for a vaccine and other basic research. And so when you compare the two competing provisions out here today, the committee position and ours, going to Puerto Rico, ours, $250 million. That island is devastated. $250 million for Medicaid funds. What's in the committee report? $126 million, half. Take, for example, the $743 million in our proposal for the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. In the committee, $449 million. Take overall the funding to HHS, $105 billion in ours, roughly half, $850 million in the committee provision. I think we shouldn't nickel and dime our response to what the World Health Organization has said and already declared a public health emergency of international concern. The urgency is now, and we ought to do the right thing. I just conclude by saying, Mr. President, we've got an Olympics that's coming up in a few months in Rio. Brazil is covered over with Zika infestation and infection. Remember, it can not only be transmitted by the mosquito, the Aegypti, but it can also be transmitted sexually. Remember also that the doctors do not know, other than to suspect, that it can be transmitted to the pregnant woman anytime during the 9 months of pregnancy. That it may not show up in the infant until years later in some developmental thing. They do know that in the first trimester of pregnancy, the infected virus is producing the babies with encephaly. And such a case was just reported with an infected pregnant woman in Puerto Rico. And so we have not heard the last of this, and you're going to see it magnified with regard to the Olympics. And so, Mr. President, sooner or later, we're going to have to face the music. Looks like we're going to face the music about half the appropriation today. Ultimately, this is a full-blown emergency. Mr. President, I yield the floor.